Hello and welcome to today's video in which I'm going to point out the differences between the new ASUS TUF A16 Advantage Edition and the ASUS TUF A17 for you to decide which one will probably suit you more. I also have a full review on the ASUS TUF A17 unit, which you can watch on my channel afterwards if you haven't done that already. These are the two configurations that we will take a look at today. They both come with the same Ryzen 7 7735HS, which is basically a Ryzen 7 6800H with a 50 MHz higher boost clock. The biggest difference between these two laptops is that the A16 Advantage is an all AMD laptop with a Radeon GPU, and the A17 comes with the 140 watt version of the RTX 4050, which by the way only uses around 90 watt as a maximum. So with the A17 you'll also get DLSS and frame generation. In most countries, both laptops will cost about $1,500. I think we can expect that the A16 Advantage won't be available everywhere though. Now probably the most obvious visual difference is the size of the laptops and their screens. The A16 Advantage has a 16-inch screen with 1920 by 1200 pixels, weighs only 2.2 kg and has a height of around 2.5 cm when closed, whereas the A17 has a 17-inch screen with 1920 by 1080 pixels, weighs 2.6 kg but has about the same height. The A16 definitely has a much better screen, which has a maximum brightness of 320 nits over the 250 nits of the A17's screen. It also has a much better color accuracy of 100% sRGB, 72% NTSC and 77% Adobe RGB, whereas the A17 only has 66% sRGB, 48% NTSC and only 50% Adobe RGB. The A16 screen also has 165 Hz with FreeSync and a super fast response time of around 7 milliseconds, whereas the A17 only gets 144 Hz with G-Sync and very slow 25 milliseconds response time. The build quality of both laptops is pretty equal. The design is a bit different though. Only the A17 does have RGB lit keys, whereas the A16 has white lit keys and no highlighted WASD and arrow keys. I like the key travel on the A17 a bit more. Both laptops have the same decent touchpad and numpad. Both laptops also have 4 air vents each on both sides, the back and another one above the upper right corner of the keyboard. Now connection wise, they both have the same connections, with the only difference that one of the USB-C connections of the A17 is a USB 4 port, and that the USB-C connections of the A16 seem to be a bit problematic for my external SSD, as it would actually wobble a bit when plugged in, which could even cause a loss of connection. Somehow it seemed to me as I couldn't plug it in deep enough, so it had too much wiggle room. The A16 does have much better speakers. I think it has 2 times 2 watt speakers, whereas the A17 only gets 2 times 1 watt speakers, sounds really terrible, has no bass at all and lacks loudness. The ASUS TUF A16 speakers at least sounded somewhat acceptable, even though their maximum loudness is disappointing as well. Both laptops have more or less the same cooling system, the same fan loudness and the same CPU temperatures. Both come with the same ASUS Armoury Crate and My ASUS app, which let you configure the performance modes, fan speeds and battery conservation mode. The A16's manual fan mode didn't seem to work though. Fans would not spin faster than on turbo mode, whereas the A17 allows for really loud full fan speed modes. The CPU throttling on both CPUs is really minor and negligible. Even after 30 minutes of Cinebench runs, they only dropped like 200 points or so. More on that later. On the normal performance mode, the CPU in both laptops will reach the designated 95 degrees Celsius on the full load in Cinebench R23. The CPUs are designed that way according to AMD, and you should not worry about it, even though I get that people are worrying about it, so LOL. PS, both laptops can go completely silent on idle and very light work, which makes them very suitable for students in my opinion, combined with the great battery runtime, which we are talking about in a bit. Software-wise, both laptops come with a anti-malware app pre-installed, whereas I had issues to get rid of the McAfee suite on the A16, which could only be done with a special deinstallation app, which was quite annoying. Other than that, there is no bloatware unless you consider the Armory Crate and My ASUS apps as bloatware. I personally don't, as they are actually useful in managing the systems. The 1TB Micron PCI 4 SSD in the A16 was faster than the 512GB Micron PCI 4 Express SSD in the A17. You can see the readings here. Both laptops come with a big 90Wh battery that allows for some great runtimes. On idle, I was able to get 17.2 hours on the A17 and 19.6 hours on the A16. Watching YouTube with a 50% display brightness and 20% loudness using headphones, I saw 7.5 hours for the A17 and an amazing 11.6 hours on the A16. On gaming without any limitations, I was getting around 50 to 17 minutes on both laptops. Even heavy gaming is absolutely possible on battery on both laptops, as the performance will only drop by around 25 to 30% when being unplugged. If you further reduce the graphics and also cap the FPS at the same time, you can actually get somewhere in between 90 to 180 minutes, that's 3 hours, of gameplay depending on the game. PS, both laptops offer a conservation mode which stops charging the batteries at 80%. The Ryzen 7 7735HS in both laptops isn't the fastest CPU ASUS could have used, but it is a fast processor nonetheless and should be absolutely sufficient for years to come. It is sporting 8 cores and 16 threads. It is actually almost identical to last year's Ryzen 7 6800H, with the only difference being a 50 MHz higher boost clock, but it's still a Zen 3 Plus CPU. Its overall performance is pretty comparable to Intel's i7-1265H, especially in work-related tasks. In games, the Intel is a bit upfront thanks to its faster single-core speed. In Cinebench R23, using the performance mode, both laptops reached similar scores, whereas the A17 has a higher maximum score of 14,254 points over the A16's maximum of 13,900 points. Though the CPUs would both get a constant 80W according to hardware info sensor readings. In PCMark 10, the ASUS TUF A16 Advantage was slightly ahead of the A17 when plugged in and had a noticeable lead on battery mode. I have made a dedicated video in which I compare the gaming performance of both ASUS TUF laptops side by side, but I also summarized the results for you in this sheet over here. Overall, the performance is pretty similar, with the all AMD A16 Advantage being a bit faster overall in most games. The RX 7600S in the ASUS TUF A16 also has a 25% bigger VRAM size with 8GB over the smaller 6GB of the RTX 4050 in the ASUS TUF A17. PS, I've also made a very extended video on the gaming performance of the A16, where I'm testing 20 games, so if you're interested in that, make sure to check that one out later as well. In Blender, I was trying to compare the RX 7600S mobile of the A16 with the RTX 4050 of the ASUS TUF A17, but all the demo files renderings resulted in corrupted images on the A16's AMD GPU. None of the rendered scenes looked okay. It was fine on the CPU though, but of course a lot slower. So right now, if Blender is on the list of programs you use, I do not recommend buying the A16 Advantage unless you make sure that this issue has been solved. In the Puget Systems benchmark for Premiere Pro 2023, the ASUS TUF A16 scored a total of 692 points, which is noticeably less than the ASUS TUF A17 with its 789 points, which is mostly due to the A17's Nvidia GPU, as Adobe clearly favors GeForce GPUs. So overall, it is somewhat weird that they gave the better screen to the A16 when it's actually the weaker choice for Adobe software or Blender, so in total for creators. Overall, I would say that for a price of $1,300 or less, these laptops would actually start to make more sense. I had a good time testing both of them. The build quality is fine, the battery capacity is very good, the performance is great even in the more silent modes. It's mostly the bad speakers and the disappointing screen on the A17 and the Blender and USB-C issue on the A16 that stood out negatively. But compared to last year's RTX 3060 laptops, right now they are probably a bit too expensive. So if you're watching this video in mid or even late 2023 or 2024, that might have changed already. So make sure to check out the current price before making up your mind. I would actually consider calling these very mobile laptops that would also make sense for a day at school or university, while still being real gaming laptops for sure. It is nice to see that ASUS managed to get rid of the issues they had with older ASUS TUFs from 2021 and 2020. That's all for today. I hope the video helped you a bit in making up your mind. If it did, or if you just enjoyed the content, please like the video or even subscribe to the channel for more reviews, laptop GPU benchmarks and other stuff. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss.